Fly over scenery like that. I used to fly along with my nose up against the window like this because I was so taken by the scenery. And it wasn't that uncommon that the first officer might look over at me and say, "What are you looking at?" Well, it just happened that I was fairly familiar with the geography of those areas, and I would say something like, "Well, I'm trying to find the city of Kulisuk. It's right over there somewhere." And then very frequently the first officer would say, "Why? Is the captain going nuts? Maybe I better take over the airplane." Okay, here we go. The FAA is wrong. Boy, how about that? The FAA wants us to believe that ETOPS means extended operations, or more specifically, extended twin-engine operations. But all of us who've actually flown an ETOPS operation knows that it's really an acronym that means engines turn or pilots swim. Well, that's not really politically correct. So in later years, it was changed to engines turn or passengers swim. That way it gives the illusion that we care about the passengers. Anyway, that's an old joke, and I know that's an old joke. So for those of you who laughed and those of you who smiled, thank you for indulging me on that. In the late 1950s, a few airlines acquired a few jets. But the 1960s was really the decade when most US airlines became jet-powered. And back in the 1960s, if you would have flown to Hawaii, or if you flew to Europe, you were probably on a Boeing 707, or you might have been on a Douglas DC-8. There were others, but those were the main modes of transportation. And in the 1970s, that's the decade when a lot of US airlines were acquiring wide-body jumbo jets. And in the 70s, if you had flown to Hawaii, or if you flew to Europe, you very likely might have been on a Boeing 747, you might have been on a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, or you might have been on a Lockheed L-1011. Well, all of those types of planes that I've mentioned thus far are 3- and 4-engine airplanes. And the reason why you might have been on a 3- or 4-engine airplane is because those were the planes of the day that had the range for long-distance international flights. But now I want to tell you about a little item that's in the regulations. If you are in a 3- or 4-engine airplane and you lose an engine, you may continue the flight. And actually what the regulation actually says is if you're in a 3- or 4-engine airplane and you lose an engine, you must land at the nearest suitable airport in point of time unless continuing the flight is as safe as landing short. So if you take off hypothetically out of London and you're on your way to New York and you lose an engine over Gander, you may land at Gander, but you may continue on to New York if doing so is as safe as cutting the flight short. Well, in the early 1980s, the airlines started acquiring the Boeing 767. And I'll bet probably all of us in the room are familiar with the 767, whether you've flown it or not. You know, it's a 2-engine, wide-body jumbo jet, small in size compared to the 747, but it is a wide-body, heavy airplane, okay? And the early models of the 767, back in the early 80s, had about 11 hours of effective range. The later models of the 767 had 13 to 14 hours of effective range, and as a matter of fact, they all were equipped with extremely accurate navigation. Now, despite the fact these airplanes had that range, early on, when airlines took delivery in the early 80s of 767s, they were all used on domestic service. TWA flew the airplanes from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles and San Francisco. United and American flew them coast to coast. Delta Airlines flew them out of Atlanta to points all over the Delta route structure. So they were used exclusively on domestic service. And the reason why goes back to another item that's in the regulations. Now, if you're in a 2-engine airplane and you lose an engine, now you must land at the nearest suitable airport in point of time. And not only that, that nearest suitable airport must be within 1 hour of where you are. It's called the 60-minute rule. It was called the 60-minute rule. Incidentally, foreign airlines, back at that time, it was a 90-minute rule. So for some reason, they had more liberal regulations. Now, I want to point out, because I know a lot of you in the audience are military pilots, I'm talking strictly now about Part 121 U.S. airlines or airlines doing business under Part 135. I'm not talking about the military, I'm not talking about general aviation, and I'm not talking about jet charters. I want to change the subject for a minute and talk about TWA, Trans World Airlines. TWA is no longer in existence. It's part of American Airlines, but prior to TWA becoming American Airlines, we had 75 years of our own history. And back in the early 1980s, when all the airlines were taking delivery of the twin-engine 767, TWA had a route from Boston to Paris, and that flight was flown by a Lockheed L-1011, which is a 3-engine airplane. Hon, would you show the map? I call my wife Hon.
That's not right.
I'm safe with doing that, right? So, back in the early and mid 1980s, TWA flew that route with a Lockheed 1011. And as you can see, the normal route for that flight was to take off out of Boston and head up across the Canadian Maritimes. Typically, you might head out to sea somewhere in the area of Gander, Newfoundland, or perhaps St. John's, or perhaps St. Anthony. And then you had 2,000 miles of North Atlantic Ocean before you came in the other side, somewhere around Ireland or perhaps southern England. Now, as a point of interest, on this side, if you took a particularly southern route, sometimes you might head out to sea in the vicinity of 42 north, 50 west, and some of our captains would point out to the passengers that that's where the Titanic sunk. And believe it or not, we actually had some captains tell that to the passengers. Well, from strictly a planning point of view, we had a lot of sharp people at TWA back in those days, and there must have been a time when some of those people were evaluating different things that we could do that would make the operation more efficient. And one day somebody came up with the idea of substituting a 767 on this Lockheed 1011 flight. And they found out that if we could only just simply substitute a 767 on this flight, we could actually save 30,000 pounds of fuel on every single North Atlantic crossing. Well, obviously that was a heck of a big incentive to see if there was some way that we couldn't make this work. But at that time, it wasn't legal to do that, because when you cross from Newfoundland to Ireland, there's 2,000 miles of sea there, and you're well out of range of being within an hour of an emergency airport. It just can't happen. So we started playing around with some alternate ideas. And one of the alternate ideas that came to mind was just what you see on the other line there on the chart. If you take off out of Boston and you start heading north through Quebec and on into Labrador. And from Labrador, you cross over to within 300 miles of Sandestrom, Greenland. And then from that point, you come down to within 300 miles of Keflavik, Ireland. And then from that point on down into Scotland, you can actually fly that entire flight, and based on a 300 knot indicated airspeed, engine out, you can actually stay within an hour of a suitable airport for the entire crossing. So we could make this work. There was a lot of planning to do, but we could make it work. Now you might ask yourself, well goodness, when you get up around Kuujjuaq and Sandestrom, what kind of airports are there? You might be surprised. They're actually pretty doggone good airports. Up around the Arctic Circle, there are a number of airports up there that were ex-military bases or refueling stops back in the Piston days. And a lot of those airports actually have full ILS instrument approaches. So there are actually some very adequate emergency airports all up through that area there. Well, there was a lot of work to do to make this happen. At TWA, we had to notify the FAA, Boeing, Pratt Whitney. Pratt Whitney made our engines. And a lot of crew procedures had to be changed because all the crews on the 767 at that time were only domestic qualified. So there was a lot of planning that had to do before we could even fly that very first flight. And in the planning that we did, we came up with an interesting idea. We were flying this flight based on an engine-out cruise speed of 300 knots because that would always keep us within an hour of an emergency airport. But guess what? When you're up at cruise altitude in a twin-engine airplane and you lose an engine, you can't maintain that altitude. You have to descend. And on board the airplane, we actually had an engine-out page in the computer that gave us the maximum performance for engine out. And this page in the computer on the airplane said that, well, with an engine out at typical international weights, we could only fly at about 20 to 25,000 feet. The best we could do would be 250 knots. Well, we still weren't there. So our procedure came to be that if we lost an engine, we had to use maximum continuous thrust on the only remaining engine that we had. And we had to drop down in altitude to the point to where we could maintain 300 knots indicated airspeed. Well, finally, everything was all set. Everything was ready to go. And hon, would you show the picture of the airplane, please? Finally, on February 15th, 1985, Flight 810 from Boston to Paris was an equipment substitution of a 767 for a 1011, and that was the very first ETOPS flight that was actually ever flown by a U.S. airline. And actually, in fact, I guess you could say really it wasn't an ETOPS flight because we were always within an hour of an emergency airport, but officially it was considered to be an ETOPS flight. Now, I'm showing you this picture because this was the actual plane that was actually used on that flight. And of course, this is a picture from the airplane being scrapped up at Victorville. And by now, I'm sure the airplane's already gone through the meat grinder. But this is actually the actual plane. It's 16002 TW. And even though the airplane right now seems to be in fairly sad shape, there's no windows, there's no engines, the fuselage is partly being stripped away. I thought this would be an interesting picture to add to my lecture today, because back when this plane was used on the very first ETOPS flight that ever existed, the mandate came down from management that there was not even supposed to be a single speck of dust on this airplane for 1 minute before it was to be cleaned off. Well, we flew these equipment substitutions. Would you go back to the route again? Thanks. We flew these equipment substitutions actually only for about 1 week. And after a week, nobody ditched in the ocean, nobody got lost, no engines failed, and the FAA granted then to us the 75-minute rule. So now we could come a little bit further south, we could come a little more direct, we could save a little more fuel. Well, this so-called test period of flying these flights lasted for several weeks, and then there was a lot of data to review. And after all of the data was reviewed, the actual first ETOPS flight that was ever on an airline schedule was flown at the end of April 1985. Would you show the bag tag, please? This is a bag tag that commemorates the very first ETOPS flights that were ever on an airline schedule. And the reason why I'm showing that, the flights were St. Louis to London, St. Louis to Paris, St. Louis to Frankfurt. The reason why I'm showing you this bag tag is because these bag tags were given to the crew members as a commemorative item for the fact that we were flying the very first ETOPS flights. And I like to think that because there were so few of these bag tags that were ever distributed to begin with, because there were only like maybe 15 or 20 crews that were involved, and each one of us got this bag tag. There are people who collect airline memorabilia. And since these bag tags are so rare and it commemorates such a significant event, I like to think that to some of the people who collect airline memorabilia, that this bag tag might be worth, what would you say, maybe $5 million? Yeah. Hey, I'm trying to do better in retirement, okay? I'm retired, and if somebody gave me $5 million, I'd be happy to take it. So if there's any offers, let me know. Well, when TWA started in late April, the very first ETOPS flights that there ever were on an airline schedule, lost my train of thought for a minute. The FAA almost immediately granted to us the 90-minute rule. And now we only had to be within 90 minutes of a suitable emergency report in case of an engine out. And that, again, on that map you just saw, that allowed us to come a little further south, a little more direct. We could save a little more fuel. But not only that, it also eliminated the need for either Greenland or Iceland as an alternate. We had to designate one, but we didn't have to designate both of them. And so if Iceland was snowed in, we could make the crossing only with Greenland as an alternate, or if Greenland was snowed in, we could make the crossing only with Iceland as an alternate. Well, I'd like to report to you that everything just went really, really well, and that the whole operation just clicked and everybody was happy. But would you go back to the bag tag again for just a second? I flew, personally, the very first flight from St. Louis to Frankfurt. And on the return trip, when we flew Frankfurt back to St. Louis, as I got off the airplane, the agent who was meeting the plane said, "Well, did you hear what happened?" And I said, "Well, no, I've been airborne for the last 10 hours. He said, "Well, the flight from Paris didn't make it." And just in an instant flashing through my mind, I thought, oh my God, what happened? This is the end of ETOPS, okay? I pictured maybe the airplane landing in Greenland someplace with 200 passengers and an engine that had failed. Well, what actually happened is the flight from Paris took off, and they had a failure of the navigational system to the point to where the airplane didn't know where it was. And as long as they were navigating in European and British airspace, of course they could navigate with VORs and non-directional beacons and all of that, but they wouldn't dare cross the ocean. And they turned around and landed back at London. The FAA finally, a year later, reviewed all of the procedures from all of the airlines that we were using in ETOPS operations, and finally they granted to the industry the 120-minute rule, which meant now you have to be within 2 hours of a suitable engine out of the airport in case you lose an engine. Would you go back to the map again, hon? But we only had the 2-hour rule for only a matter of weeks before the 2-hour rule became the 2-hour and 13-minute rule. Yeah. Okay, now this is serious. And you might think, the 2-hour and 13-minute rule, what the heck is that all about? With the 2-hour rule, there was a little gap here right in the very middle of the ocean where we were just simply outside that 2-hour range. So the FAA gave us another 13 minutes, which in fact then opened up the entire Atlantic Ocean to ETOPS operation. And even if you were to come south, then we were using the Azores as a potential alternate instead of Iceland or Greenland. Finally, the 3-hour rule opened Hawaii, and as soon as the 3-hour rule opened Hawaii, every airline that has 767s, 777s, all of those types of planes, they were all flying those airplanes to Hawaii. And as a matter of fact, Aloha Airlines, out of business now, but Aloha Airlines was flying 737s from Burbank to Honolulu, San Diego to Honolulu, and so forth. As a point of interest, if you're flying to Hawaii and you're just past the midway point on your way to Hawaii and you lose an engine, you're not going to Honolulu, you're going to Maui, because that's actually closer. There are still some off-limit areas in the world, off-limit, no-go areas as far as ETOPS is concerned. And if we were looking at a globe, you would actually even see where they are. They're the southern oceans, the southern Pacific Ocean, the southern Indian Ocean, even the South Atlantic. Okay, those are no-go areas because they're simply areas on those routes where you reach a point where you're not within even 3 hours of anything. And this will be more familiar to Patrick because we've already talked about this. Qantas flies a route from Santiago to Australia. They also fly from Perth to Johannesburg, and South African Airways actually flies from Johannesburg to Brazil. And those are 3 airline routes that must be flown by a 747 because they're simply out of any range that would be acceptable for ETOPS. Now, ETOPS, as you can tell from our conversation thus far, is entirely planned on the idea of if you lose an engine, where are you going to go and how soon can you get there? But it might actually surprise you to know that I want to say engines do fail, but very, very rarely. It's not unheard of, but it does happen. But what would you think would be the most common reason for an airline diversion? And I'll tell you what it is. It's actually passenger medical problems. People with heart attacks, chest pain, shortness of breath, all that sort of thing. That's the most common thing that can cause an airline diversion. And that's followed up by other mechanical problems such as pressurization, hydraulics, electrical. Engine failures, of the list that can cause airline diversions, engine failures are actually way, way down the list. Excuse me a second. At TWA, and every other airline as well, after we got into this ETOPS operation, we thought to ourselves, let's take a closer look at some of these alternate airports where we could land. We knew that all of these airports had adequate runways. We knew that they had instrument approaches down to those runways, but we didn't know much else besides that. And one of our managers one day said, well, let's take a closer look at some of these airports like Goose Bay and Kuujjuaq and so forth. Let's evaluate what would happen if we actually, really, honest to goodness, had to land there. Well, we found out some interesting things. At Goose Bay, Labrador, and this is back in the mid-'80s, remember, in Goose Bay, Labrador, there were only 112 hotel rooms in the entire city. And at any given time, half of those hotel rooms were occupied. So if you ever landed there and you had to have everybody spending the night, somebody would have either had to sleep on the airplane, or you might have hoped they would be ready to double up in hotel rooms. You'd hope that they would be in love or something like that. In Sandestrom, Greenland, Sandestrom only had limited hours of operation back in the mid-1980s. And for the time that we were going to use Sandestrom as a potential alternate, we had to give them 4 hours notice to keep the airport open for us. And you had to pay them $600 an hour during that time just to keep the airport open, just so that we could land there if we had to. And as a matter of fact, we never did have to. On one of my own flights over Narsarsuaq, Greenland, which is toward the southern tip, that was not one of our engine-out alternates because the terrain around Narsarsuaq is simply unacceptable when the weather's bad. So we could never designate Narsarsuaq as an alternate, but we all knew that on a clear day, they did have a nice long runway and you could land there if you absolutely had to. So on one of my flights one day when we were within radio range of Narsarsuaq, I called down to ground operations and I explained that whole thing. I said, look, we're not going to land there, but you know we could if we had to. But tell me, what's on the ground in Narsarsuaq? What's there? And the guy came back and he said, well, TWA, how many passengers do you have on board? I said, well, about 200. He said, well, I wouldn't land here if I were you. And I said, okay. Well, it turns out back in the mid-1980s at Narsarsuaq, they did not even have any air stairs on the airport that were capable of being wheeled up to a jumbo jet. So if you wanted to deplane all of the passengers, they all would have had to climb down a ladder. And as you might expect, in Narsarsuaq in the wintertime, the temperature is frequently below 0. Well, where do we go from here? As I mentioned before, all of this business about ETOPS is about the airlines. It does not apply to the military, it does not apply to general aviation, and it does not apply to private jet charters. But ETOPS is there, it applies to the US airlines. The Joint Aviation Authority is the organization that controls all of the foreign carriers, and actually their rules, though, are very similar to our rules. ETOPS certification is actually only applicable to the individual airline because airlines can vary in the level of ETOPS range that they get. It's applicable to the particular airline and also the individual airplane and whether the airplane has GE engines or Pratt Whitney engines. 3 hours, 3-hour ETOPS, 180-minute ETOPS, is actually common in the industry. But to reach that 3-hour level, an airline has to go through 1 year of successful operations at the 2-hour level. It's proposed, as a point of interest, that the Dreamliner 787 and also coming, the Airbus A350 will have ETOPS regulations that allow beyond 3 hours. That, in effect, would open up the entire world, and Patrick, that would open up your routes that we've been talking about across the southern oceans, because the Dreamliner and the Airbus A350 are proposed for that, and that would in fact open up the entire world. But now you have to ask yourself, whether you're a passenger or a crew member, either one, if you were on a flight and you lost an engine, how comfortable would you be with the idea that you might be 3 hours away from a suitable landing airport? How comfortable would you be? And if you're a little bit uncomfortable with that, I have to say, it's too bad. because that's the direction of the industry, and it's not going to change without some dreadful disaster. That's the direction of the industry, and so that's where we're going. My friend John McCarthy told me in the last several days that one of the notable events in his life is that he was on a 737 that lost an engine, but in the process of the engine failing, there was this oily residue, probably from the bleed air, that got into the air conditioning system and filled the cabin with this oily, smelly, smoky residue. So how comfortable would you be with the fact that you had 3 hours to go before you could land under that scenario? Well, if you don't like it, it's too bad. Yeah, thank you. Would you show the plaque, please? On my bookshelf at home, okay, wait. Okay. On my bookshelf at home, I just have this plaque displayed in my office, and it says to Richard Bennett, that's me, first scheduled commercial operation of the Boeing 767 in transatlantic service. And it means what it says. That very first flight back in February 1985, on the very first test ETOPS flight that there ever was, I flew that flight. But before you think I'm talking with my ego, because I don't mean to be, it wasn't all about me. I was on a team of about 15 people that put this all together, and actually I was fairly junior on the team. But there were about 15 of us who were involved in this project to get ETOPS going, and that's in my history. And as a matter of fact, though, on that very first flight, actually Captain Cheryl Weems was the captain. I was a captain, and I was flying in the first officer position. And we had a third captain, Captain Ken Palmer, who was actually the relief pilot. And so can you think of a situation that could be any more dangerous than that? one airplane with 3 captains on board, okay? Now that's, yeah, okay, I see some nods in the audience, thank you for that. It sort of reminds me a little bit of that famous line from Moby Dick, where the Captain Ahab stood up on the bridge and he said, "There is only one God in heaven and there is only one captain on this ship." Well, we certainly violated that rule, didn't we? Well, I have a lot of pride in telling this story because at this point now, there are more twin-engine airplanes crossing the world's oceans than there are any other types of planes at all. And at TWA, we were behind getting the whole thing going and getting it started. So this has been kind of fun here, coming here today and talking to you all and telling you this story. And I think at the next meeting, I'm going to be out there in the audience with you guys because this is a great organization. But now, if you have any questions, providing they're easy questions, okay, they have to be easy questions, I'm at your service.
Easy.
Oh, sorry,
Easy.
sorry.
So in view of ETOPS, what's the future for 4-engine jet transports?
That's a good point, because if you Google ETOPS, which I did in part of the preparation for this lecture, one of the things that's pointed out is that a lot of the airplane manufacturers are simply not building 3- and 4-engine airplanes anymore. Now, they're not total relics, but you know, the MD-11 just it came and went, and there are still 4-engine airplanes being built, but nothing at all like the number of twin-engine airplanes, and it's because twin-engine airplanes can now fly the world's oceans. Yes, sir.
The increase from 1 hour to 75 minutes and this fairly fast incremental increase.
Yes.
Was it due to the fact of just the performance of you going to fly, or did it have anything to do with the reliability or the FAA's assessment of the reliability of the engines?
I think both. I think all of that. I mean, I don't think there was anything that was being overlooked.
But was there any new data from 60 minutes to 90 minutes about reliability of the engine that made them make that decision, or what brought them to extend it?
I can't really say that for sure because I don't know, but I kind of suspect that from the get-go, everybody knew that we wanted to extend to where the oceans would be unrestricted. I mean, I think everybody was on board with that idea. But whether specifically there was any certain data that caused them to increase each time, I can't really say for sure. Yes, sir.
What was the liaison between the industry and the FAA that allowed them to increase this all the time? Was there an effort behind the industry towards the FAA to have them accept these increments?
You know, that would have been back office talk that I'm just not privileged to know. I mean, I can't say for sure. I mean, I think my answer is going to be somewhat what I told that gentleman over there. I think everybody was on board with where we were going with this. Everybody wanted to reach a level where the world's oceans would be open to twin-engine planes. But at whatever plateaus we might have had along the way, I can't really tell you. I know that we did start in increments, and it was sort of like a slow process of seduction along the way. We did start at 60, went to 75, went to 90, went to 2 hours, and then we went to 2 hours and 13 minutes. But what was involved in back office politics when we went from each of those increments, I can't tell you. I wasn't involved in that. Sorry. Yeah, Patrick.
What was the difference in lapse time between Boston, Paris, and Boston, Greenland, Paris?
Yeah. You know, I don't really remember. I'm sorry. I mean, obviously it was a longer flight to go way up north like that and come down, okay? The 30,000 pounds that we knew that we would save in fuel was based on not having to do that. It was based on the fact that we knew eventually we'd get a direct route, okay? But also, here's another factor that's a partial answer to your question. The 1011 cruised, and I'm going to say it cruised at, I think, 8.4 or 8.5, and the 767 cruised at 8.0. So we were a slower airplane anyway. So, but I think it might have taken an extra hour. John?
I don't know if you can answer this question. Last year or 2 years ago, we took an Emirates flight from LA to Dubai. The heading out of Los Angeles was 001 degrees. Okay?
Yeah.
And the approach to Dubai was 179 or something like that.
Yeah.
We went straight over the pole.
Yeah.
I've never really examined what total polar flight ETOPS numbers are in terms of getting to a runway.
And nor have I.
Okay, the other question is, I'm assuming an airline like Emirates has more access to runways in Eurasia. I mean, the flight went right over Moscow. It went right over Tajikistan, one of the stands, I can't remember, right over Iran, right over the Caspian Sea, right over Iran. I'm assuming that the ability to do it's not really an ETOPS question, it's more of what kind of places can you land if you lose an engine in certain territory.
If you can't hear him in the back, he's asking about engine out alternate airports. And I mean, the only answer I can give you is sometimes there's lots of airports where you don't even know they're there. In very, very, very northern Greenland, there's what used to be Thule Air Base, okay? And all across the most northern rim of Canada, there are other similar airports. There's, is it called Resolute Bay or something like that? And coming down the other side, long before you got into any area around Moscow, there were airports in northern Norway. I mean, they're just there and they're available to be used.
Right.
And you wouldn't ever want to land there under any normal circumstances. But there's lots of airports that can be designated as engine out alternates.
It was a 17-hour flight on the 767.
Wow. 17-hour flight from here to Dubai. Yes, sir.
Is there any kind of measurement, like out of 1,000 flights,
767.
how many were actually medical emergencies? what engine out that they had to land? Or out of 10,000 flights, 100,000, how many times did they actually have to land?
You know, somebody kept those statistics, but I don't know the
Is it almost
statistics.
never?
Yeah, and I don't know the statistics. But also, I mean, you made reference in asking that to something about medical emergencies. Back at that time, well, for sure, if there's a medical emergency on board the airplane that's serious, I mean, you want to get the airplane on the ground so you can get the passenger treated. But I can't tell you how many times we would make an announcement through the cabin that if there's a doctor or nurse on board, could you please assist us, we need assistance. And even under more rare circumstances where there might be a medical problem on board the airplane, you would make that announcement, but if nobody volunteered, we actually had a means where we could use an HF radio, high frequency radio, and contact a service that we had contracted in Phoenix, where we would get directions from the ground as to how to handle emergency conditions that were beyond the scope of the crew.
Just one more thing, there's some
Yeah.
disbelief that the flight, the 17-plus hour flight, it was a 767, they called it an extended range, but it was it's a long flight.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. Wow, thank you, John. Did we get it all? Oh, yes, sir, sorry.
When you, because of RVSM, which came in probably after you retired, but
Yes, it did.
there's certain things they have to do to the airplane all the time.
Right.
Did they have to do that on ETOPS also? Was there certain other equipment they had to put on board?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, absolutely there was. Because when we first started, the very first ETOPS flight there ever was, these planes had been used on domestic for several years prior to that. And when TWA took delivery of our 767s, we never envisioned using them for international. So there were a lot of modifications that had to be made. They did not have HF radios. We had to put in 2 HF radios. We had to upgrade the cargo fire suppression system. Is anybody else in here a 767 pilot? Okay. Well, yes, sir. Okay. The cargo fire suppression system was based on just shooting a big fire extinguisher into the cargo compartment, staying into it. But in order to qualify for international, we had to have that fire bottle, but we had to have a second fire bottle that then did a metered exchange over the next hour and a half. And also, of course, there's on a 767, 2 alternators, 1 for each engine. The APU, we had to add another alternator. So there had to be 3 operational with the APU standing by. So there were a lot of modifications that had to be made to the original 767 so that we could do this. And of course, later 767s that were delivered probably all came with this equipment because then everybody knew that they were going to be used for international service. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Do you know, was there any significant failure rate between Pratt & Whitney and GE and if applicable Rolls-Royce engines?
Oh boy, I don't know about Rolls-Royce, and I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to say I don't know why this is, but GE engines are looked upon with more favor than Pratt & Whitney, and I don't know why that is. Okay? Yeah. And incidentally, to give you a more complete answer, at TWA we had Pratt & Whitney engines, and at American Airlines they had GE engines. And so when American Airlines took over TWA, they didn't even really want our airplanes because there would have been the conflict in the engines. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.